am here today with Professor John Peterson. John Peterson is an affiliate assistant professor of humanities at the University of Dallas, where he coordinates the school's classical education graduate program for K-12 teachers and administrators. John, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so let's start off talking about what education is. In your article, you say that conservatives know what they want out of education, but they don't really know how to get there sometimes. You distinguish between two types of education, what you call a classical civic education and a progressive and global education. Can you talk about these terms a little bit more and what you mean by them?
Sure. So, I mean, quite simply, education is the raising up of a human being, context of their family, a community, and society. So the big distinction that I would make between progressive education and sort of more traditional mainstream education would be that focus on the responsibilities of a human being, the virtues of a human being, and in a particular context. So the virtues of a child, then of a parent, but then of a citizen, as a member of a faith community. As an alternative to that, sort of modern mainstream progressive education focuses on the individual and that individual's desires, occupational desires. So it doesn't really focus on their partnership or membership in those communities. Mm-hmm. So my focus my point about education and conservatives is that they often know what they're against. They see the outcome of education, they see the focus, they see the ideological, and they say, that's not what I want. But then when they try to say what it is that they want, they end up saying things that are more in line with their progressive opponents than they realize. So for instance, they'll say, let's get the ideology out of it. Let's just focus on teaching skills, mm-hmm. Right? But skill training is not, that's not liberal education in the full sense, right? That's not a classical education. That's it's a necessary thing. It's a good thing to learn skills, to learn trades. But the idea that by merely focusing on skills or ostensibly more objective fields like STEM training, that's going to be in any way an antidote to the ideological focus of mainstream education is mistaken.
Interesting. So let's talk about mainstream education and that's currently present in K-12 schools. So you agree in your article that there's a certain degree of indoctrination that takes place, teaching students more about systems of ideas and whatnot. But you agree that such indoctrination is more of a byproduct of a dull and insipid, you say, right. Curriculum. Could you elaborate on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, many of the teachers in our public schools, and I mean even in our private schools, their heart is in the right place. They're driven to help children. They're not ideological in any kind of radical sense. They're not trying to transform students to be as opposite of their parents as possible, as Dewey said. Right? They're not. They don't see themselves as firebrands who are sort of igniting zeal in their students. However, they go to schools of education, and they themselves have had training in higher ed, which leads them to think about what education is in a way that lends itself to the ideological dimensions that are prevalent, right? So for instance, you mentioned systems of ideas, which is something I mentioned, right? That's just a way that social studies is taught, right? Which is a departure from the older focus on history, which is that human beings have virtues and vices, and that they make decisions and which are consequential, and that people play roles towards on good paths or bad paths, right? When you talk about systems of ideas, you suggest more that there are larger cultural forces which are to which we are all subject, right? That there's not sort of this constant touchstone of nature which we can be, by which we can be good or bad, but rather that there's a sort of forces of transformation that one needs to sort of be aware of and attach oneself to and ride the wave of or not, right? So that's a very progressive, tending toward ideological view of what history is. Where you would say, the people in the past were ignorant, and we know more than them, right? And so it lends itself to saying, like, well, wherever the zeitgeist is going, that's what I should be on board with. So students who are educated this way, the sort of natural inclinations to resist the latest ideological wave, right? Because that's been worn down by their education. So those teachers are not actively trying to. I mean, some of them are, but they're not actively trying to turn them into, uh, liberal progressives. But that's the result often, right? And so those teachers, that's a trickle down to some degree um, from higher education, but that's not to say that by transforming higher education, you're going to fix this problem. You need to fix this problem by transforming how schooling is done in the at the K through 12 level, is what I would argue.
That's interesting. Looking at it from changing instruction in K-12 schools will involve to a certain degree how teachers are taught.
Yeah.
Teacher preparation in ed schools.
Yeah.
And you talked a little bit about the problem of how teachers are taught in the first place. And so I'm interested in the program that you help manage at Dallas. It's also a teacher education program. Yeah. How it's different from ed schools that you'll see at different universities?
So most of our students are teaching in charter schools or private schools or homeschooling networks. Some of our teachers are, they've had a 20-year career and they're returning to education, or they've been, a stay-at-home mom for a decade, and now they're returning to school, and they might have had an education degree in the past, but the way that they've taught or that they want their children to be taught is not that way. So we're not necessarily an education training program. It's a sort of hybrid classical education sort of master's. So it's a sort of hybrid academic and training program, right? There's a practical component, even though, so it's sort of like student teaching, even though our students are mostly already teachers. And then there's sort of academic component. So it's like a continuing education master's program.
I want to read this quote of yours, which I think really gets to the crux of your article. To truly reform education, we must seek to immunize the minds of students from the academy's own attack. This is why we cannot have a meaningful conversation about the practical reform of higher education without talking about primary and secondary education. Can you speak a little bit more to this point about immunizing students' minds so that they're prepared when they go to higher education to be able to think for themselves?
Right. Yes. So I would say that if you were to very sort of casually and bluntly characterize what happens in higher education as a kind of brainwashing, which to some degree is right. I mean, you especially not in the classes, but especially in larger schools, state schools, which have whole departments and programs for onboarding freshmen, right? They're actively trying to, sort of change the language that they use, introduce new categories of thought, all of that. I would say that that doesn't succeed on any student who can already think clearly, can recognize what is being offered to them. It takes a certain moral strength as well, right? Especially if there are social pressures like praise and blame that go along with not being one of the crowd. But it's certainly possible, and many students do this, to pass through that without being touched by that. And so how does that work? Well, you need to actually be able to think, right? So returning to the trivium fundamentally, you need to be able to think about how ideas relate to each other. What is a logical argument, right? And then how is an appeal made? And on what grounds? So a classical education that works would be one, or liberal education would be one that makes the student not enslaved to the sort of trend, but also to just mere opinion, right? That they're able to make an argument. They're able to recognize when they're being deceived, or when an appeal is not to justice. And I mean, another way of putting it is, and this goes to my point a lot about how conservatives sort of fail to understand what it is in education that they really want to promote.
Yeah.
But another way of putting it is, you need to be able to think synthetically, or you need to be able to think about the whole. So how does some claim that's being made, or some argument, or some truth, something that I'm learning, whole understanding of what is true and good and beautiful, right? So that you're not divided in your mind. You don't have a little box that says like, oh, here's my faith box, but then here's like the science box, and then here's these other things, these other facts, and they're just distinctly separated, and they don't touch on each other. I mean, that's what a kind of Socratic instruction will do, is will lead out of you what it is you think. It will bring out contradictions in your thinking. It will bring out kind of connections to other subjects, other areas, in surprising ways. But a more analytic way of doing things would be, say, let's break this down into its parts. Let's analyze it from above, as if it doesn't touch us, as if it doesn't transform us, right? As if we're just applying tools, like a surgeon cutting apart a body, that we're unaffected by, right? So, I mean, a lot of science and mathematics and technical education, it doesn't actually, contribute to the understanding in the same way that what we call the humanities does, in the way that it is often taught, right? And even subjects like, the more humanities subjects like English, history, philosophy are often taught in this kind of level of analysis, right? Like, let's just describe what is Aristotle's theory of X and Y, Plato's theory of X and Y. Not, is this an account of is this true, what is being claimed here? And if it is, how do I connect it to what else I know is true? That would be the kind of antidote to the claims that are made on the authority of science in higher education, on the authority of science, but also of history, in the sense that I talked about before, with the sense that history is a force unto itself and is progressing, and where it's going is what's authoritative for us, and we are sort of just along for the ride, and it's going to reveal to us new things, right? So that now transform our understanding of what is good. So as an alternative to that are windows to the truth. That is to say, the truth of the human being and what is good for human beings. Only subjects taught in that way could in any way be an antidote to the ideological approach of the higher education, which masks itself as a kind of disciplinary, highly technical authority.
John, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation. I'm encouraged.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you.